Have you ever wondered what happens when the overlooked become the unstoppable? You have 30 seconds to explain how we lost $200 million on a single contract. Richard Blackstone's fist slammed down on the mahogany desk with enough force to make the crystal picture frames rattle. In the conference room on the 40th floor of Blackstone Enterprises, 12 white executives in Italian suits remained silent, staring at their briefcases as if the answers would magically appear in the luxurious leather. Outside through the glass wall, Grace Williams pretended to be busy organizing documents on the reception desk. At 32, she had worked as an administrative assistant on that same floor for 7 long years, invisible to most of the powerful men who passed her daily as if she were part of the furniture. "Mr. Blackstone," stammered the vice president of finance, "Morrison Corp's proposal simply outstrips ours in every technical aspect. They've offered impossible deadlines and margins we can't even figure out how they calculated." Richard, heir to a $2 billion construction empire, ran his hands through his gray hair. At 58, he had never faced such a devastating string of defeats. In the last 6 months, the company had lost 5 consecutive million-dollar contracts, all to the same rival. Grace bit her lower lip, fighting the urge she had felt for months. For years, she had watched these men make the same basic strategic mistakes, presenting inflated proposals and unrealistic schedules. As someone who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, a degree she had kept tucked away in her drawer for 7 years, she recognized every glaring flaw. "How is it possible," Richard continued, his voice echoing through the room, "that a company founded just 3 years ago is destroying a 50-year legacy?" That's when the reception phone rang. Grace answered in her usual professional voice, "Blackstone Enterprises." "Grace speaking." "Miss Williams," said the familiar voice on the other end of the line, "this is James Morrison from Morrison Corporation. I'd like to speak to Mr. Blackstone about an acquisition proposal." Grace felt her heart race. Morrison wasn't just winning contracts. He wanted to buy the entire company. Through the glass, she saw Richard gesticulating furiously at his executives, completely oblivious to the fact that his corporate death warrant was literally waiting on the phone line 2 feet away. For a moment, Grace hesitated. She could simply transfer the call and watch passively as the Blackstone empire crumbled before her eyes. After all, how many times had Richard walked past her without even a greeting? How many times had she heard whispered comments about support staff and people who know their place? But something in the way Richard hung his head, defeated for the first time in his privileged life, aroused an unexpected compassion in Grace. Or perhaps it was something more calculated, the realization that this moment of vulnerability could be exactly the opportunity she had been waiting for years. "Mr. Morrison," Grace said calmly, "can I put you on hold for a moment? I'll check Mr. Blackstone's schedule." As she put the call on hold, Grace glanced back at the conference room. Richard was now leaning against the window, gazing out at the city he had once ruled, unaware that his salvation or his ultimate destruction depended entirely on the next words of a woman he barely knew existed. Can you believe one decision could turn the tables? If you're loving this twist, subscribe to Black Voices to see how it unfolds. Grace kept the call on hold as she watched Richard gesticulate desperately to his executives. The irony was almost cruel. The man who controlled a billion-dollar empire was completely blind to the fact that his salvation was sitting 2 feet away, organizing his files with the precision of someone who understood every number in those reports better than anyone in the room. "I need solutions, not excuses," Richard shouted, his voice piercing through the glass. "Morrison came out of nowhere and is systematically destroying us. How can a 3-year-old company come up with proposals that sound like they were written by wizards?" Grace took a deep breath and pressed the transfer button. "Mr. Blackstone, James Morrison on line 2. Richard paused his tirade and looked in her direction for the first time in weeks. "Morrison now," he answered with trembling hands. "Richard, my old friend," Morrison's voice echoed through the speakerphone, laden with false cordiality, "I hope you're having a good day despite the recent circumstances." "What do you want, Morrison?" "Straight to the point." "I admire that." "I'm calling to make you a generous offer for Blackstone Enterprises. $300 million. Cash on the table." The silence in the room was deafening. $300 million was less than 15% of the company's actual value just a year ago. You're trying to buy me out for a song, Richard said, his voice controlled, but with anger boiling beneath the surface. Richard, let's be realistic. Your company has lost 5 consecutive contracts. Your investors are nervous. Your employees are looking for other jobs. I'm offering you a dignified way out before things get even worse. Grace clenched her fists. For 7 years, she had watched Morrison grow from a small contractor to Blackstone's biggest rival. And for 7 years, she had watched the patterns in his victories. Always beating Blackstone's bids by impossible margins, always delivering schedules that seemed to have access to insider information. I have a question for you, Morrison, Richard said. How do you calculate such precise margins? How do you know exactly what materials to use and when? Morrison's laugh was genuine. Talent, Richard. Something your company seems to have lost in recent years. Maybe it's time to accept that not everyone is cut out for this business. It was at that moment that Grace made a decision that would change everything. She stood up from the table, walked over to the conference room, and knocked on the glass door. 12 pairs of eyes watched her with surprise and irritation. Mr. Blackstone, she said calmly, may I interrupt for a moment? Richard covered the phone. Grace, I'm on an important call. I know. It's about Morrison Corp and how they're winning our contracts. Richard's expression changed from irritation to curiosity. Do you have information about that? Grace looked directly at him, her eyes reflecting a confidence he had never noticed before. Mr. Blackstone, with all due respect, I know exactly how Morrison is winning. And I know why you're losing. Morrison was still on the line, probably listening to every word. Richard, who is this? Richard studied Grace's face for a long moment. For the first time in 7 years, he really saw her, not as part of the furniture, but as a person with something important to say. Morrison, I'll have to call you back. Richard, don't make that mistake. This offer has an expiration date. Then I hope it's a long expiration date. Richard hung up the phone and turned to Grace. You have 5 minutes. Impress me. Grace walked over to the conference table, ignoring the uncomfortable glances from the executives. She picked up the last proposal and opened it to the cost page. You've calculated concrete at $85 per cubic meter, she said, pointing to the table. Morrison offered $62. You assumed he was operating at a loss, right? Obviously, replied the CFO. It's impossible to get quality concrete at that price. Grace turned a few pages and pointed to another section, but here you specified imported grade A concrete. Morrison used domestic grade B with specific additives. Same strength, half the cost. Legal and within the technical specifications. The room fell silent. Richard leaned over the table. How do you know that? Because I've read every proposal that's come across this desk for 7 years. And because I have a degree in business administration that you never bothered to find out about. The shock on the executives' faces would have been comical if it hadn't been so revealing. For 7 years, they had walked past Grace every day, never imagining that the woman who organized their files knew as much about business as they did, perhaps more. You have a degree in business administration? Richard asked incredulously. Harvard summa cum laude, specialization in project management and cost analysis. The bomb had exploded. One of the older executives, Mr. Patterson, leaned forward. Why is a Harvard graduate working as an administrative assistant? Grace looked him straight in the eye. Because 7 years ago when I graduated, I received 132 job rejections. All polite, all professional, all citing that I wasn't a good fit for the company culture. Imagine that. The sarcasm in her voice cut through the air like a knife. Richard understood immediately. A young black woman with a Harvard degree had been rejected by companies that hired mediocre white men with half her qualifications. So, I took this job to pay the bills while I kept looking. But it's funny how after a few years of watching you guys make the same mistakes Morrison avoids, I realized that maybe it wasn't the other companies that were the problem. Richard felt the weight of every word. Go on. Morrison isn't winning because he's smarter. He's winning because you're predictable. You always specify premium materials when similar ones would work. You always calculate schedules with excessive safety margins. You always assume you're the only ones who can do the job right. Grace picked up another folder from the table. And while you do that, Morrison studies your previous proposals, identifies your patterns, and offers more efficient solutions for the same results. That's impossible, said Patterson. Our proposals are confidential. Grace looked at him with an expression that clearly said he was more naive than he thought. Mr. Patterson, you've been outsourcing your printing to Top Print for 5 years. The owner of Top Print is the brother of Morrison Corp's minority partner. You really think your information is confidential? The silence that followed was absolute. In 5 minutes, Grace had identified not only why they were losing, but how Morrison had access to inside information. Richard watched her with a mixture of admiration and horror. For 7 years, he had had the solution to his problem sitting right in front of him, and he had been too arrogant to realize it. Grace, he said slowly, can you help us beat Morrison? For a moment, Grace hesitated. She could just say, no, quit, and watch the Blackstone empire crumble through sheer incompetence and arrogance. It would be sweet revenge for 7 years of invisibility. But as she looked at Richard, really saw him perhaps for the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected. It wasn't just desperation in his eyes. It was recognition, perhaps belated, perhaps forced by circumstances, but genuine nonetheless. I can, she said finally. But not as an administrative assistant. And not for the same $28,000 a year you think my time is worth. Richard nodded slowly. What do you want? Grace smiled for the first time in years. Not the polite, submissive smile she wore at work, but a smile that revealed the sharp intelligence she had kept hidden for so long. I want you to find out that sometimes the most qualified person in the room isn't the one you'd expect. And I want the chance to prove that 7 years of watching you make mistakes has taught me exactly how to fix them. If you're hooked on Grace's rise, subscribe to Black Voices for the stunning conclusion. 48 hours after the bombshell revelation in the boardroom, Grace found herself in a position she never imagined she would occupy, sitting in the Italian leather chair that once belonged to the fired CFO with full access to the company's systems and an impossible mission ahead of her. So, our new special consultant, Patterson said, pronouncing the title with barely concealed contempt. How exactly do you intend to solve a problem that our best experts haven't been able to figure out in 6 months? Grace didn't look up from the spreadsheets scattered across the desk. First, Mr. Patterson, I'm going to need you to stop referring to me as our special consultant in that tone. Second, your best experts made mistakes that any first-year business student could spot. The silence in the room was deafening. In 1 week, Grace had gone from invisible to indispensable, but the internal resistance was palpable, especially from Patterson and 2 other veteran executives who saw her meteoric rise as a direct threat. Richard Patterson turned to the CEO. Are you sure this is wise? She may have a Harvard degree, but practical experience is very different from academic theory. Grace finally looked up, and Patterson recoiled slightly at the intensity of the gaze he met. Mr. Patterson, you're right about one thing. Practical experience is important. That's why I spent the last 2 days hacking into Top Print's systems. The bomb exploded again. Richard leaned forward. You did what? Technically, it wasn't hacking, Grace smiled for the first time in days. It was basic social engineering. I called Top Print, pretending to be from Blackstone's internal audit department, and said we needed to check their printing records for tax compliance. Within 20 minutes, I had complete access to their files. She connected her laptop to the projector and a series of documents appeared on the screen. Here are all our proposals from the last 18 months. And here, she clicked on another folder, are the files that were accessed from the Morrison Corporation terminal. Always 24 to 48 hours before the proposals were submitted. Patterson paled. That's industrial espionage. Not just espionage, Grace continued, her voice growing intense. It's much worse. Look at the timestamps. She pointed to a series of dates on the screen. Morrison wasn't just viewing our proposals. He was modifying some technical specifications in the original files. Richard rose from his chair. Modifying how? Changing material codes to slightly inferior but still acceptable versions. Adjusting schedules to create slack that didn't exist, inserting inflated costs into specific sections. When we submitted our proposals, they already contained subtle sabotage that he knew exactly how to exploit. The revelation was devastating. Morrison wasn't just stealing information. He was actively sabotaging Blackstone's proposals from within. How is that possible? Richard asked, visibly shaken. Grace hesitated for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything, because Morrison has an accomplice inside this company. Someone with access to the final files before they go to print. The silence was absolute. All eyes turned to each other, suspicion weighing in the air like toxic smoke. Are you sure about this? Richard asked, his voice low. I'm more than sure. I have proof. Grace opened another file. Here's the access log for the Regional Medical Center proposal files. 3 people accessed the final file. You, Mr. Blackstone, me, when I was organizing it for printing, and she paused dramatically, someone using Mr. Patterson's login at 2 a.m. 12 hours before the presentation. Patterson exploded. That's ridiculous. I never, how dare you accuse me? I've been with this company for 15 years. Exactly, Grace said calmly. 15 years. That's enough time to develop resentment, especially when the company started losing contracts and bonuses were cut. Richard, you're not going to believe this, Patterson struggled to find words. This black woman you've dismissed for 7 years. Grace finished the sentence with a cold smile. Mr. Patterson, you're making the same mistake Morrison made. You underestimate people you consider inferior. But I have a question. How would you explain the $50,000 deposited into your personal account 3 days after each lost bid? Always from a shell company registered at the same address as Morrison Corporation. Patterson recoiled as if he had been physically struck. His face went from angry red to ashen gray in a matter of seconds. I can explain. You don't have to, Grace interrupted, because I've already explained everything to the FBI. They'll be here in about an hour to arrest you for industrial espionage and corporate fraud. The confession came pouring out. Patterson collapsed into his chair, admitting everything. The years of resentment, Morrison's approach, the increasing payments, the financial pressure of an expensive divorce and gambling debts. The man who for 15 years had built a reputation for corporate integrity revealed himself to be a traitor willing to destroy the company that employed him. As Patterson was led away by security to await the arrival of the feds, Richard turned to Grace with a look of admiration and terror. In 72 hours, you identified our problem, discovered our vulnerability, gathered enough evidence for a federal arrest, and exposed a traitor who worked alongside us for over a decade. What else are you hiding? Grace leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. Mr. Blackstone, 7 years of watching this company has taught me more than any college ever could. I've learned that people like Patterson see me as a threat, not because I'm incompetent, but because I'm too competent for the position they think I should occupy. She opened a new folder on her laptop. And now that we've eliminated the inside leak, I can start working on the really interesting part. Destroying Morrison Corp using the same tactics they used against us. Richard sat up slowly. What do you have in mind? Morrison believes he knows our weaknesses because he studied our proposals for 18 months. But there's something he doesn't know. Grace smiled. And for the first time, Richard saw not just intelligence, but a calculated strategy shining in her eyes. I've studied his proposals for the same amount of time. And I've discovered patterns that will reveal not only how he builds his winning strategies, but also something that will destroy him completely. What kind of patterns? Grace deliberately closed her laptop, the kind that will make the next meeting between the two of you the last of his business career. At that moment, her phone vibrated with a message. Grace glanced at the screen and her smile widened. Mr. Blackstone, our situation just got even more interesting. Morrison has just requested an urgent meeting to discuss new terms for the acquisition. Apparently, Patterson's arrest reached his ears faster than we expected. He wants to move up the purchase because he knows he's lost his inside source. No, Grace shook her head. He wants to move up because he believes we're vulnerable without our inside security. Morrison hasn't realized yet that Patterson wasn't our weakness. He was his. Richard watched Grace meticulously organize her files, each movement precise and calculated. Grace, I have a question. If you're capable of all this, why did you spend 7 years organizing my papers without saying a word? Grace paused her organizing and looked at him directly. Because sometimes, Mr. Blackstone, the best strategic position is the one no one considers a threat. For 7 years, I was completely invisible to you. And invisible people see everything, hear everything, and no one ever suspects what they really know. She stood up, picking up a specific folder from the desk. And now that strategic invisibility will become the most powerful weapon Morrison has ever faced. Because he made the same mistake you all did, he assumed that competence has a specific look. As she organized the last few documents, Grace allowed herself a moment to reflect on the irony of the situation. 7 years ago, she had been rejected by 132 companies that considered her profile inappropriate for their corporate cultures. Now, that same inappropriateness was about to save a billion-dollar empire and completely destroy its main rival. Morrison requested the meeting for tomorrow at 9 a.m., she said, checking her phone again. That's enough time to prepare the presentation that will end our corporate war once and for all. Richard nodded. But something in Grace's expression intrigued him. You seem very confident for someone who discovered an internal betrayal just a few hours ago. Grace smiled, and this time Richard saw something that made him question whether he really knew the woman who had worked alongside him for 7 years. Mr. Blackstone, can I make a confession? I've suspected Patterson for over 2 years. I just needed time and access to gather enough evidence. 2 years? And you never said anything? Because until now I've never been asked my opinion on anything important, and because some revenge, she paused, her eyes flashing with an intensity Richard had never seen before, needs to be served at the exact moment to have the maximum impact. As Grace finalized her preparations for the final showdown with Morrison, a single question hung in the air. If she had strategically planned Patterson's downfall for 2 whole years, maintaining absolute silence while meticulously gathering evidence, what other secrets could such a calculating mind be keeping for the perfect moment of revelation? The next morning, Morrison arrived at Blackstone Enterprises, accompanied by 2 lawyers and an accountant, clearly expecting to formalize the purchase of a collapsing company. His confident smile vanished when he found Grace sitting at the conference table next to Richard with a stack of documents organized in front of her. Mr. Blackstone, Morrison said, completely ignoring Grace. I hope you've reconsidered my offer, especially after the recent developments with your staff. Yes, Morrison, Richard replied calmly. The developments have been very enlightening. Grace, would you begin? Grace smiled coldly and opened the first file. Mr. Morrison, before we discuss any acquisition, I would like to clarify a few points regarding your business practices. Morrison finally looked at her annoyed. And you are? I'm Grace Williams, Director of Strategic Operations at Blackstone. And you, Mr. Morrison, are about to find out what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. She connected her laptop to the projector. The first image showed bank transfers. Here are the payments your company made to Patterson over the course of 18 months. $50,000 for confidential information. Morrison's face remained impassive, but his lawyers exchanged nervous glances. This is just the beginning, Grace continued, moving to the next screen. Here are the modifications you made to our files through Patterson's access. Industrial sabotage documented with precise timestamps. You can't prove anything, Morrison said. But his voice had lost its previous confidence. Grace smiled. I can and I will, because while you thought you were playing us, I was playing you. She clicked on another file. Recognize this email, Mr. Morrison? It's from your personal account to Patterson detailing exactly what information you needed for each proposal. Morrison paled. How did you get my personal emails? The same way you got our files. The difference is I'm better at it. Grace opened a new folder. 3 months ago when you hacked our systems through Patterson, I was watching. And while you were gathering our information, I was gathering yours." The revelation hit Morrison like a bolt of lightning. He had been monitored for months without knowing it. "Here's my favorite," Grace said, playing an audio file. Morrison's voice echoed through the room. "Those idiots at Blackstone are so predictable with Patterson feeding us everything. We can lower our bids and still win every time. It's almost unfair. Where did you get that recording?" Morrison exploded. "Patterson used a Blackstone company cell phone. All calls are recorded for training and quality purposes. Did you know that, Mr. Morrison?" Morrison stood up abruptly. This was a trap. "No," Grace corrected. "This was justice. You spent 18 months stealing information, sabotaging bids, and destroying a 50-year-old company. You thought you were untouchable because no one would suspect your tactics." She opened one last file. "But here's what you didn't know. During those 18 months, you lost 3 major contracts that you didn't even try to get through us." Want to know why? Morrison didn't answer, but his desperate expression was answer enough. "Because your illegal methods became your only strategy. When you tried to compete honestly, you discovered that your company is mediocre. You're a second-rate con artist masquerading as a business genius." Grace stood up, picking up a final folder. "The FBI will be at your company in about an hour. Industrial espionage, corporate fraud, system intrusion. Patterson has confessed everything in exchange for a reduced sentence." Morrison was now visibly shaking. "What do you want?" "Justice," Richard replied. "Grace, can you show him the last item?" Grace smiled one last time. "During your 18 months of sabotaging our company, you also sabotaged 3 of your own contracts without knowing it. The files Patterson stole included false information that I planted specifically for you. Congratulations, Mr. Morrison. You destroyed yourself with your own weapons." The room fell silent as Morrison processed that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had considered irrelevant for 7 years. "Grace," Richard said with genuine admiration. "How did you plan all this?" 7 years of watching Mr. Blackstone. Long enough to learn that true intelligence isn't about being the smartest person in the room, but about letting your opponents think they're smarter than you. 6 months later, Grace was sitting in her new office on the 42nd floor, now as executive vice president of Blackstone Enterprises with a 20% share of the company's profits. The position had been created specifically for her after she saved not only the company, but expanded it into 3 new states. Morrison was serving an 8-year sentence for industrial espionage. His company had been liquidated, his assets confiscated, and his name had become synonymous with corporate failure in business circles. "Grace," Richard said, walking into her office with a report. "We just closed the biggest deal in company history, $500 million. She smiled, looking out the window at the city she now saw from a completely different perspective. Funny how things change when you finally allow competence to be recognized regardless of appearances. Richard nodded, visibly embarrassed. "Grace, I need to apologize for the 7 years I..." "No, you don't," she interrupted gently. "Those 7 years taught me something valuable. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest strategic advantage you can have." That afternoon, Grace received a call from Harvard asking her to give a lecture on corporate leadership. The woman who had once been rejected by 132 companies was now being invited to teach others about success. The best revenge, she always told young professionals, is not to destroy those who underestimated you. It's to build something so great that they can never deny your competence again. Morrison had tried to destroy a company by attacking its weaknesses. Grace saved it by revealing its true strengths, starting with recognizing that talent has no color, social class, or expected appearance. If this story of perseverance and justice has touched you, subscribe to Black Voices for more stories that prove that competence always finds its way, even when the world tries to keep it invisible.